Hi, this is Brett Ingram, award-winning entrepreneur, and today I want to share with you 10 great podcast interview questions. So, podcasts are super popular, and maybe you've thought of starting one, maybe you've even already started one. But one of the big challenges that we have when starting out in particular is figuring out what kind of content we can offer that people are going to really enjoy. And there are a lot of different ways that we can go about creating a podcast. One of the great things about it is there is no right or wrong when it comes to format. But one of the most popular types of podcasts is the interview podcast, and with good reason. Because when we create a interview podcast, a couple really valuable things come out of that and that we get from it. Not only do we get sort of the networking opportunity to be able to meet a lot of people in whatever walk of life or industry or niche that we're in, but in addition to that, we're not responsible for coming up with all of our own content, right? Because if we have a guest on who's an expert in something, then we can interview them and they're going to provide the content. So it makes it a lot easier in terms of being able to have our own content. It makes it a lot easier if we're a little self-conscious about our own knowledge level. Sometimes we may start a podcast where we aren't the expert. We just happen to have a passion in that particular area, and that's fine. We don't have to be an expert in order to start a podcast. But what we need to do at the end of the day, and this is what it's always about, is what value can we provide to the audience? What reason can we give them for tuning in? And that's ultimately what it's all about. And the idea of doing interviews on a podcast is really popular because once you start to get a format down and you get guests to come on the show, it's very easy to ask them the questions, create an engaging episode with high quality content, and you can do it before or without being an expert yourself. So the thing of it is, and the question that I get all the time is, how do I create a good interview podcast, or how do I ultimately ask questions? What are the great questions to ask? So it's important to understand that creating a great podcast interview will hinge on the questions that we ask. Because if we have somebody who's on and great, and I don't know if you've ever seen this or experienced this, whether it's with a podcast or maybe a TV interview for someone that you were really excited to hear about, and the interviewer sits there, asks them a few softball questions, and goes off on a tangent in some area that you're not really that interested in, and then all of a sudden the interview's over, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I was hoping that they were going to ask this and ask that, and I didn't even get that information. We don't want to be that person. We want to be the person that everybody in our audience is saying, that's exactly the question I wanted answered. That's exactly what I was hoping to know. And while by no means is this an exhaustive list, I want to share 10 questions that are really effective and really valuable in podcast interviews. They can really help delve deep into your guests' experiences and perspectives, and that can make for a very engaging and an insightful episode. Now, it's important to note that first off, obviously, depending on the niche or depending on the experience area, you can get more specific with the questions. These are questions that will apply to basically anyone in any niche, so you can tailor them a little bit. But the idea is, when you put them all together, what you'll see is that it creates a really good narrative and an opportunity for the guest to shine and show what they know, and an opportunity for the audience to be entertained, informed, and educated, which is exactly what we want. So the first question is, can you tell us about a moment in your career that was particularly challenging and how you handled it? Now, again, these aren't in any particular order. So again, they can be ordered in a way that makes sense based on the guest's experiences, based on whatever else. And again, if you're dealing with someone who you're not talking about careers, you're talking about a hobby, you would just insert the word hobby there instead of career or whatever. So hopefully you get the idea in terms of what we're getting at here. But the idea there is, what you're doing is you're helping the audience understand, first of all, this person's going to expose a little bit of vulnerability, which is always good because it's very easy to see people at the mountaintop in whatever career or profession they're at and think how talented or lucky or skilled they must be. When in reality, oftentimes, they've gone through tremendous challenges and maybe had even been on the verge of quitting at one point or another, and yet they stuck with it. And that's a really valuable lesson for the audience and for ourselves as well. So if we can glean that, if we can get that out of our guest, that's excellent content. And so the question allows the guest to be able to share a personal story. We all love personal stories. They can showcase their resilience and their problem-solving skills, which also makes them look good. So it's something they're going to want to answer because it's going to make them look good to the audience and help share what they know without sounding like they're bragging. Because if they were just to say that, people would say, oh yeah, they're so full of themselves. But if it's asked in an interview question, they have no choice but to answer it. And it's going to make the people in the audience feel as though they're getting information, they're getting tips and tricks, and maybe some moral courage to be able to do, or psychological courage to be able to do whatever it is that they need to do and stick with it, even through challenging times. The second question is, what misconceptions do people have about your profession or industry? And this is a really good one too, because what happens is when someone is considering going into one, and I know for entrepreneurship and business, this is particularly true. A lot of people come into starting a business or becoming an entrepreneur based on one particular idea they had in their head of what they thought it was going to be like. But once you actually start doing it, you realize there are a lot of things about it that aren't quite the way that they're advertised, or they aren't quite the way that they're made out to look. Again, if we're looking at the person who's already laying on the beach drinking Mai Tais, they've already accomplished everything, so that's great. But there's a lot of struggle that goes into that. There's a lot of loneliness. There are a lot of other factors. And being able to pull back the curtain and give people a look, again, helps people understand what actually is entailed with this particular career, profession, hobby, whatever it is. And so therefore, it will help them clarify whether or not they want to be able to go into that or not. So it gives the guest a chance to clarify the common misunderstandings and provide insights into their field that maybe the audience has or hasn't heard before, but certainly isn't going to be the common wisdom that they would have gotten everywhere else. That is, and that's an important theme that you'll see running through all these questions. What we want to do is we want to get information from our guests that allow them to share things that are unique to them and that are things that they wouldn't have else heard otherwise. That benefits the guest because they're able to stand out and showcase who they are, what they've done, and their perspective. And it benefits the audience because it's not something that they've already heard 100 times. The third question is, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned throughout your journey? This actually happens to be one of my favorite questions. By the way, one of my favorite questions to ask, but also one of my favorite questions to answer. Because I can think back across my entrepreneurial career to a number of different incidents where I had issues where they were potentially existential. Like I didn't know if I was going to continue being an entrepreneur. And those inflection points are really important to be able to share because it helps someone who's in that place, and no matter how difficult things are, to keep going, to understand that people have been there before you, they've gone through this, and they're able to do it. There's a reason that for groups of people, for people that have experienced traumas in their lives in various different circumstances or tremendous hardships, there's a reason that there are support groups. It's not because people are weak. It's because people want to be able to associate with someone who understands who they are and where they've come from and what they've been through. If I've never struggled with a particular issue and I have a friend who has that issue, they could come to me and they could share that with me, and I will listen and I will be empathetic and I will try to understand, but I will never understand it on the same level as someone who's already been through it. And that is the value there. And so when you get somebody to share that kind of information, it helps people that are in that place right now feel better, feel encouraged, and feel like they can do it too. So it's insights into personal growth and professional development that can be invaluable for listeners. And by the way, it's also a nice way for the guests themselves to feel good about what they've accomplished as well. Oftentimes, as human beings, we don't take a lot of time to sit back and reflect on our accomplishments, what we're capable of, or what we've done. We spend a lot of time thinking about the stuff that we want to achieve still, or that we haven't achieved, or the shortcomings and the things that we need to fix. But we don't spend a lot of time like appreciating ourselves or rewarding ourselves for successes that we've had. And when you ask a question like that, it gives you that opportunity to go back and live in that moment and feel like, hey, yeah, you know what? I did that. That's pretty cool. So that's another win question. The fourth question is, can you share an experience where you took a huge risk and what was the outcome? So this is a nice question because, again, it allows the guest to show off a little bit, right? They've done something that's really risky, or they've done something that's unconventional, and so they can get out there and they can share it. But the other thing that it does for the audience is it helps the audience understand that just trying to follow the same path that's already been trodden, that's already beaten down, is rarely the way that you're going to achieve anything great. It's rarely the way that you're ever going to achieve anything of super significance. Oftentimes, the people that change the world are the ones who do it in an unconventional way. I don't remember the person's name, but in the track and field event, the high jump, for years and years, everybody went and jumped over the bar forward. So they ran toward the bar. If you don't know what the high jump is, it's basically mats with two poles and a bar that goes across in front of it. And you have to run up, and you can get a running start, and you have to jump up over the bar without knocking it off the thing. You can touch it, but if it knocks off the posts, off the stanchions, then it doesn't count. And for years and years, people went forward, head first. And then somebody realized, hey, wait a minute. If I run and I jump up backward and arch my back, I can actually get a lot higher. And that person set the world record. Now, there's not a single high jumper that jumps any other way but backward. So risk-taking is always a compelling topic, and it can really illustrate the guest's decision-making process, their bravery, their courage, and the impacts of that. And that can also help encourage the guests or the audience to want to do the same, to want to take that risk that maybe they've been contemplating but were afraid to endeavor to do. Fifth question is, how do you stay motivated and passionate about your work? This is another question that I really love because I don't care who you are. I don't care what walk of life you're in. I don't care how successful you're at in it. Whether you're a famous musician going up on stage, or whether you're a titan of industry, or whether you are, whatever it is that you do, it doesn't really matter. There are days where it's harder to get up and go to work. There are days where you're just not feeling it. You don't have that passion. And people who excel, people who achieve great things, find a way to overcome that. The mistake that a lot of people make when they think about people who are super successful is that they're always 100% motivated and ready to go, and they want to, and if I'm just not like that, I could never. Nothing could be further from the truth. The most successful entrepreneurs in the world, while their daily routine might be jump out of bed, go for a run, eat my breakfast, it's 4:30 in the morning, that might be the normal routine. But I can promise you, there are days when that alarm clock goes off and the arm reaches for the snooze button and wants to just hit it. The difference is the people who accomplish great things don't hit the snooze button. They think about it, they fantasize about hitting the snooze button, but they get their butt out of bed and they get to work. And so the thing that's great about that is, A, it shows that even people at the top of their field are people that struggle with motivation sometimes. And B, it shares some strategies about how any of us can get ourselves up and motivated for doing things when we need to. I personally have made a couple episodes about that myself for that very reason. Because I've had days where I'm unstoppable and I've jumped out of bed in the morning and I wish the day went longer. I wish it was 40 hours long. And there are days where I woke up in the morning and all I wanted to do is go back to bed. It was hard to focus. It was hard to... So there's things in our personal lives. There's all kinds of different things that can impact that. But the fact is, this question can reveal personal strategies for maintaining enthusiasm and drive. And that can be very inspiring for listeners, again, because they know these other people have been in the same boat. And also, now I have a strategy for overcoming it. The sixth question is, who has been the most influential person in your career and why? So this is great because it allows the guest to showcase someone else, to brag about somebody else and thank them. And it also shows the fact that having a mentor is super important. Having a mentor can make a big difference in your career and in your life. And discussing mentors and role models can be very relatable, and it's motivating for listeners to think that this person who's doing what I want, that I respect so much, needed a role model or had a role model or a mentor, makes it A, okay for me to need one too. They didn't do it all on their own. And B, makes me recognize the value of it, because if they're up here and they're thanking somebody for it, it must have made a big difference. And I can tell you in my own personal journey, that is my biggest regret or my biggest failure, is that I never went out and got a mentor for what I was doing. So I was learning everything on my own. And that is a far harder way to do it. I would highly recommend to anyone and everyone that we get a mentor for what it is that we want to accomplish. The seventh question is, what does a typical day look like for you? This question is awesome because oftentimes, like, we see the end result of what somebody does, but we don't know what goes into it. And when we get to pull back the curtain and really see what they do from the minute they get up to the minute they go to bed or whatever else it is, that's fascinating. Look, there have been YouTube channels and social media channels and everything else made just about this very topic, where literally all they do is walk around with a camera all day. And it's fascinating to see what people do, particularly if they're people in our industry, particularly if they're people with our hobbies or interests, and particularly if they're people that we respect. To actually be able to see what they do on a daily basis is really fascinating. It's funny because when I used to work in staffing, one of my colleagues had his wife had worked for one of the big hedge funds here in Connecticut. And her boss, the guy who ran the hedge fund, he had 6 personal assistants. She was one of them. And one of the things that this guy did on his daily basis, to talk about the Truman Show, because he was a trader, when he was at his desk, he had multiple cameras from every angle on him and his screen that were broadcast all over the office. So all the other traders in the office could see what this guy who was running the company, what trades he was making, and talk about a day in the life. They got to see every minute of the life if they really wanted to, which I always thought was a fascinating story. It's not me, I wouldn't want to do it, but I understand the value. And those questions help listeners understand the day-to-day reality of the profession, hobby, or life, which is really valuable. And the 8th question is, what's the best advice you've ever received? So slightly different than the mentor. This could have come from anybody. This could have come from a person at the grocery store, right? Doesn't matter, person at the coffee shop. But whatever advice somebody gave you that you believed was the most valuable, when you ask that to a guest, it'll make them think. It'll make them feel like you're a really good interviewer and that you really care. But it also will allow them to probe their own memory banks to think about advice they've gotten and be able to share something that's really valuable. So it can provide listeners with practical wisdom that they can apply in their own lives, in their own careers, and everything else. The 9th question is, looking forward, what are some exciting developments or projects in your field? This just gives people a sense to take a look at what they're looking at for the future. This is less even valuable in terms of what's actually going to happen in the field or in the profession or the hobby. It's more valuable to get an understanding of how the guest thinks about that stuff. Are they really focused on what's coming and how they're going to approach it? Because that can help us with some clues about how we should too. And so that is a good question that focuses on the future and can highlight innovative ideas and upcoming trends. That'll be particularly useful for anyone who is trying to get into the industry or the business or the hobby. And the 10th question is, if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be? And I love this because this is the old mentor in reverse question. It allows the guest to think back across all the decisions they made, all the actions they've taken, all the mistakes they've made, all the successes they've had, and figure out what things they could have done that would have made it faster, easier, and more efficient. And when they share that advice, it's great advice for people in the audience because those people can now hopefully shortcut some of the issues that they would have had and sidestep some of the pitfalls. Reflective and often revealing, this particular question can connect personal growth with the professional insights, and that's a great marriage right there. These questions are versatile and they can be tailored to fit any guest, so you get a rich, engaging conversation that provides the value to the audience, which is ultimately the most important. So the takeaway here is that interviews are a great way to start a podcast because we don't need to be an expert, and our guest is actually creating all the content. But the quality of the episode depends upon the quality of the questions we ask, because that can prompt the most useful and impactful responses from our guests. If we think about what our audience would want to know from our guests, if they were talking with them one-on-one, we'll get ideas of the exact questions that we should